Hello, namaskar. Good morning, Alicia. Good morning, Ashraf. Oh, good morning. And we have evening in the India. Mhm. I know you can meet Ashraf, um, uh, poet, novelist, journalist, and a scholar. And Alicia, Ashraf has read very well in the book. She is an activist, poet, teacher, friend, mother, granddaughter, mother, granddaughter, daughter. So she is a wonderful woman. So I want to introduce her because she was the person who impressed me for the poetry therapy. So now I want Ashraf to start talking because I came as only host, and Ashraf will talk to Alicia, and Alicia will reply to all. In between, I will explain if somebody asks in uh, Hindi or other language.
Yes, I had a good chance actually to read about Alicia in your book, Saxena, The Fist Which Opens. And I read her story, which in that about poetry in concentration camps. And I quote from her story as poetry as a strategy to resistance. She was talking about victimized poets who write for everyday survival. And this is the way she helped herself to encounter and pass and win by the end that experience, that severe experience, actually. So she was talking about the exercise that intellect, poetry's immediate function to help the authors recover from their integrity as human beings in control of their history, individuals who belong to human beings and the world community. So I will start by asking here, do you consider it a kind of freedom, writing poetry, especially in prison, that experience? You could talk about it as a way of freedom. One of your poems, you was talking about doves in your blood, which are freed to talk about you better. Alicia.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Rati, Saxena, and thank you, Ashraf, for this opportunity to be with the world at this moment, to break borders, to keep breaking borders and frontiers. And thank you for having read my scholarship, because very few people read the scholarship. It's a little more boring than reading the little school and then reading the poetry, I guess. And what happens is, I think for me, poetry is what connects more as to our humanity. So when you are in a place when the torturers, the genocide perpetrators want to destroy your humanity, then poetry connects you with that and helps you resist. And and solidarity does too, right? So when that poetry can at the same time connect with solidarity, when that poetry is not an elitist act of, just engaging your own soul there. And then for me, I mean, it's not a recipe for freedom, it's not a recipe for solidarity, but for me, it works. And I found out that it worked for people who were in concentration camps, for people who were victims of the Nazi genocide, of the Holocaust. And it does work for people who suffer torments, torture, imprisonment, disappearances in Latin America. And thank you for quoting the article.
Yeah, you, Alicia, you are talking about yourself, your experience. So you can give us, you could through the book, but now we want a live, some sort of experience or showing to many of those who didn't read the book. So how did poetry help you healing yourself in hard times?
Poetry alone might not have helped me heal. And sometimes I say that healing is highly overrated, because it's a whole process of achieving justice, what ultimately healed me. And the only way my writings achieved justice was by a movement, by solidarity, by people listening, keeping my books alive, because I could have written and it could have been a little relief for me, right? And in this concentration camp, in the secret detention camp that you're mentioning here in the little school, I couldn't write. I didn't have pencil or pen, but I was there. I spent in that place 105 days. I was with my hands tied, my eyes blindfolded, in this secret detention place run by the military during the dictatorship. So we are in Argentina back in the 70s. In 76, we had a military coup. And in 77, I mean, I joined the resistance when the military coup happened. I always joke that I'm, in the last wagon of the train. When everything goes wrong, I go there, right? And I was a college student. I was the age of my students now. And I had a little girl, and luckily she survived, because one of the things that is at the core of my struggle and the core of my telling is, what did you do with the children you disappeared? There are 500 children who were born in these secret detention places or taken away from the families. And those children, we are still looking for them. So I was there. My husband was taken there. I was at home one day. I knew they could come for me, because I was in the resistance. I was gathering information on what they were doing. So I knew. A lot of people didn't know, because everything was censored. The media was censored, and the Congress was not working. There was a military coup. So, but I knew, and I knew they had taken my friends, some of my friends, my compañeros. And so, but you're never ready for that. So I was taken to this place, and where we were starved, we were beaten, we were sexually abused, and then I thought I was going to be killed at any point. And then a baby was born there. The baby of Graciela Romero, the Mets, and Raúl Mets. And we are still looking for that baby. So I'm the witness of that birth. And 40 years later, we are still looking with Adriana, the sister who survived. She was a little girl. We are still looking. So, but most of my friends who were there, most of the people who were there were killed. And so anything that I do in writing, in telling, in anything is for truth, because they denied this, and for justice. And after that time there, I was taken to a prison where I was disappeared 2 more months. So I was 5 months disappeared, which meant that my family didn't know where I was. Nobody knew where I was, and the military were denying that I was in their hands. This is a technique that then they exported to South Africa, right? I mean, as if South Africa needed one more repressive technique, but they trained the people in South Africa, the military in South Africa, to do this disappearances. So after that time, I was moved to a prison for political prisoners, and I spent 2.5 years as a political prisoner, no charges. And then we had the possibility of applying to the option, was called the option, to remain in jail in this prison for women political prisoners, where I couldn't touch my daughter. We had to see each other through a glass. I couldn't, every 45 days. Or remain in prison or leave the country. That was the option. I applied to leave the country, not because I wanted, but because it was the option. And at that time, it was during the Carter administration and the human rights policy, which worked for Latin America at that point. And so they allowed me into the United States as a refugee.
I see. Regarding this era, this time in such a prison, you couldn't touch your daughter, but even you couldn't send her letters or poems because of what they call censored Marxist contents. So it's like black comedy movie. What could be Marxist contents in a love poem, for example, for your daughter?
My voice befriends the winds to reach you, tender heart, fresh eyes. Listen,
yes, this is the one translated today into Arabic. This is the one.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Let me tell you how it is pronounced. I will read it for Arabic for you, and this will be good also for Arabic listeners. It will be some sort of letters for them. You was writing إلى ابنتي رسالة من السجن أنا اصغي حنجرتي تصادق الرياح ليصل إليك صوتي عزيزتي ذات القلب الرقيق والعيون الجديدة اصغي ضعي أذنك على صدفة البحر أو بهاتف السجن سيء السمعة واصغي ما أهون السبب وأنقاه تماما فهو مثل قطرة ماء أو بذرة تناسب راحة يدك سبب بسيط للغاية لم أستطع التوقف عن النضال من أجل سعادة من هم إخواننا وأخواتنا.
Thank you.
I think the last 2 lines are those censored Marxist contents. You are fighting for your brothers and sisters.
Yeah. Yeah. You want me to do it in English?
Yes, please.
Listen.
And in Spanish, if you like.
Okay. To my daughter, letter from prison. Listen, my throat befriends the winds to reach you, dear gentle heart, new eyes. Listen, place your ear to a seashell or to this infamous prison phone and listen. The reason is so simple and so pure, like a drop of water that fits in the palm of your hand. The reason is simple. I could not keep from fighting for the happiness of those who are our brothers, our sisters. Escuchá, mi garganta se hace amiga del viento para llegar hasta vos, corazón tierno, ojos nuevos, escuchá. Poné tu oído en el hueco de un caracol o en el parlante infame y escuchá. La razón es muy simple y tan sencilla como la gota de agua o la semilla que te cabe en la palma de la mano. La razón es muy simple. No podía dejar de pelear por la alegría de aquellos que son nuestros hermanos.
I will learn the Spanish to read it like that. Thank you.
Ashraf, 1 minute, Alicia. Some Hindi audience are there. So, Manju Mahima, they wanted to, they are trying to understand. And so they are asking, so in one paragraph, I will speak for them in Hindi. तो मैं आप लोगों के लिए हिंदी में बताना चाह रही हूँ कि ये एलिसिया पार्टनोई है जो जिन्हें कंसंट्रेशन कैंप यानी यातना शिविर में रखा गया था क्योंकि उनके देश में अर्जेंटीना में उस समय सैनिक coup हुआ था, यानी सैनिकों ने अधिशासन कर लिया था अपने देश का। और उस समय जो छात्र थे उन्होंने इसका विरोध किया। कुछ बातें हम आजकल भी देख रहे हैं ऐसी। और वो जो उस समय एलिसिया 21 साल की ही थी, उनकी एक छोटी बेटी भी थी, लेकिन वो उसमें सब में लगी हुई थी, जैसे आज भी हम देख रहे हैं कि बहुत से छात्र लगे हैं। और अशरफ अबोल उनसे सवाल कर रहे हैं। तो सबसे पहले इन्होंने ये बताया है कि किस तरह से अशरफ ने ये पूछा है कि आप कंसंट्रेशन में कैंप में गए थे तो क्या आपने कविता का सहारा लिया था? तो उन्होंने एलिसिया ने बताया कि मेरे साथ में इतना ज्यादा मारपीट, सेक्सुअल अब्यूजमेंट और तरह के टॉर्चर हुए थे, लेकिन उस समय मैं ये नहीं कह सकती कि मेरे को सिर्फ कविता ने हेल्प की, लेकिन हाँ मैंने कविता बाद में लिखी है और उन कविताओं ने बाद में हेल्प की है। तो उस समय जो कंसंट्रेशन कैंप में जाते थे उनके लिए ये हो जाता डिसअपियर, यानी गायब। उसके बारे में कोई सवाल नहीं कर सकता था, ना कोई सब बैन था। तो अशरफ ने ये पूछा है उनसे कि आपने एक कविता भेजी थी जिसको वहां से रोक दिया गया था, जिसके लिए कहा था ये तो मार्क्सिस्ट वो है, मटेरियल है। तो वो कविता पहले अशरफ ने उनका अनुवाद अरबी में करके सुनाया, बाद में वही कविता एलिसिया ने इंग्लिश में और फिर स्पेनिश में सुनाई है। तो अब हम इंग्लिश में फिर से जा रहे हैं, आपको जहां लगेगा हम बता देंगे हिंदी में। थैंक यू। ठीक है, इट्स ओके, फाइन। आई जस्ट वांटेड टू एक्सप्लेन few people in Hindi.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Thank you.
Now you please.
Yes, in this age of pandemic, I believe we passed by a lot of wars, personal, global, but this is the first time ever that enemy is struggling the whole humanity. There is one enemy, which is the virus, which is struggling everywhere, and you cannot catch it. It's like what is beyond dictatorship, actually. you win over dictatorship in some countries, but this kind of dictatorship by a virus, by pandemic, is so difficult. So I think uniting with some virtual thing like poetry through this means could help us to go past this time, this hard time.
Yeah. The problem is that this virus strikes more the people who are marginalized, are poor. So
Yes.
So this virus, I mean, I say in my country, Argentina, I have two countries now, but in Argentina, there is a government at this point that is a government that I support, that many of the members there were also victims of the dictatorship. And this government is giving the people the resources to fight against the virus, is investing the money in vaccines, is giving stimulus to people. So less people, I'm not saying that everybody is okay, but less people are affected. And the people who are against the measures, the healthy measures taken by the government to avoid the pandemic to spread. But my reflection is many of those same people were the same who said there was no dictatorship, there was no genocide. So the virus affects everybody, but not everybody the same way. We know that. So the reason why we risked our lives and we were in the resistance was so there were not these kind of differences. So when something like this happened, like a health emergency, everybody could be, access to medicine, access to the resources, now the wealthiest access. I still say in Argentina, almost 10,000 people died by this virus because the measures in a population of 40 million. So the measures that the government is taking are better than the measures that the government of the United States, who does not care at all for the marginalized, is taking. But the military disappeared and killed 30,000. So the military did more against us than the virus so far. So people don't see that. And so when we ask for justice 40 years later, they say, oh, forget it. It happened already. But we are not, there was no vaccine against the dictatorship. The only vaccine was solidarity and risking our lives. And we died in that. My friends died from that virus. It was, I don't know. And then poetry. This is what we are talking about, right? When the pandemic started and we had to stay at home, my husband, who was also a political prisoner, I was 3 years in jail. My husband was 40 years in jail. And so we said, well, we are used to confinement. We're trained for this. We are better. We have wine. We are together. We have food that we can eat. That is, we can get in touch with our friends. So we were, but then there are things that trigger, because if we suffer trauma, for me, Zoom is a bad experience. And I had to get used to, I couldn't touch my daughter because there was a glass in between for all this time in the prison, and then I have to talk to my grandchildren with a glass, like the screen there, and I can't touch them. So I had to work all these triggers back and see, well, I cannot be isolated. But for many years, I could never use FaceTime on my phone. I wanted to be with the person. I couldn't be, and so, we have
reality, not virtual.
Yeah, I want to add something. I want to add something. This situation was not in every country. The early days for me especially, or maybe not only me, many of us were terrific, not because we were suffering, because we had food, we had a house, we had everything. But I saw that, and it happened in South America also, in many countries. But in India, it happened that the day lockdown was declared, that many migrant workers who were not poor people, who were earning very good salary, were were thrown out of the house because they didn't have salary, didn't have money, and they were walking miles and miles, 500 miles, 1,000 miles, alone walking, keep on walking because they wanted to reach, because they were afraid. They thought that we are on the road in the city, and then we go back, and they thought that in my village will save me. they, and they were continuously walking. Nobody could do anything. Government was not very supporting. These things were happening. Before that, we also had something like this, some agitation, and some students came out and they were supporting, and now they are in jail. Many people who were working for the tribal people, they are also jailed. But so that situation has not changed. We are in facing the same situation what you faced, or you may face in future. Some other country may face in future. So once these people went home, then they find there is nothing, so they have to come back. So they don't have anything. So this was a terrific situation. Though we had food, we had, but it was terrific for people like me, many people, or I think most of us, that we are inside the house, but we cannot help them. Very few came out to help them. But how can you help thousands and thousands people going on? And it is not that in, because when you see the dress code and all, you people feel that they're poor. They were not poor because like some because they are coming from their village for a job, and they were earning quite good money, like a cook, like a bara, like, and they, because they were living in a hotel at night, because daytime they were working, so they didn't take house, and most of them uh, wanted to go back to home. That is why they didn't have any place to live, only the rented some rooms. So those, they were thrown out of from rented rooms, and situation was terrific. Now they are coming back, and the same situation. So for me, this is more than virus. There are many more social, political, ideological issues
Yes.
which hurt all of us. And these
Yeah.
things, this is the story, keep on going. Yeah, because I also say, Rekha, because you know that I live in South India and I always live almost alone. So I said, I'm habitual, I'm living alone for 10 years. So this lockdown is nothing for me. But this is terrific. So I want
Yeah.
to know about I know I want to about know this, that I know that after this you help your country to save your people, to find out the lost one, and to you could stand against the culprit. That story also, if you share, I will be happy.
Thank you for clarifying all that. And the reason we can keep going is because we are doing this work of solidarity. In the United States, I mean, I came as a refugee, and it was a good time for me to come from Argentina as a refugee. This is one of the works I put together with people from an organization called Freedom for Immigrants. The immigrants who came through the borders to the United States now are in horrible living conditions when they are in the jails where the COVID is hitting them, and all the system has collapsed, so they don't have their day in court, or also many thousands of them are pushed to the border where they are in what they call refugee camps, but they are basically also concentration camps with no bathroom, I mean, nobody knows they are invisible populations. Um, and Ashraf was asking how how poetry helped me, how writing helped me, and because I wrote, and the relatives of the disappeared could read what I wrote, and they could bring it to the judges. When the trials for justice started in Argentina, it was a long process. It took us 35 years to put the guilty ones in jail. So I had to testify. I testified many times until finally there was the will to do justice. I mean, that's what happens. So, so the moment I felt my writing and my whole life made sense as a survivor was when I presented the book, A Little School in my hometown, because it was published first in English. 20 years the book was in exile, and it came back in 2006. So while the kids in the United States were forced to read this book in college, in many classes, in my country, nobody had read it. And so when it came out in 2006, I presented it in the university we attended with my friends that were killed. And there were hundreds of people who had come, the relatives of the disappeared. And among these people was Adriana, the sister of the baby who was born in there. And she was there with her own children. And I have a story that is called Graciela Around the Table, that is about her mother. When she was pregnant, she was blindfolded and she was made to walk around the table for exercise so the delivery could be easier. Then the baby was born. I was witness of that because I saw her afterwards for a minute, and then she was taken away, and we don't know where. She was killed, obviously, and her husband too. And the baby, we are still looking for that man who is 40 years old. So Adriana was there in the audience, and when I presented the book, we spoke about the legal issues, about the trials, about the justice, and then she raised her hand and she said, I said, you have a question? No, I want you to read about my mother, she said. And I have two stories. One is nativity, when the baby is born, and this baby is born in a secret detention place. So this baby is born in the middle of death. But there is a story about Graciela walking around the table. So I said, which one? And she says this. And the moment that this daughter validated what I imagined could have been Graciela thinking at that time, was my most brightest moment as a writer. Because I said, well, I mean, this touched her in a way that is respectful. Because sometimes intellectuals and writers, we think we speak for others, right? It's a lie. We don't speak for others. We just manage to listen to others. Sometimes we're bridges.
Yeah.
So,
Alicia and Rati, this kind of years separated from guilt to justice, it is happening actually everywhere. I remind you with something in Gwangju in Korea. It was in the 80s, but it took some 20 years to approve. It was a revolution, and it was against dictatorship. After so many people fell as victims of such revolution. So it takes many years as a kind of, round and round trip. It's guilt to justice and taking years. And the lessons in Argentina actually, as if they are not here, because we are observing the same story in some other geographies around the world. So it is difficult. So whatever justice comes, there will be no justice to be approved for all. It means after this, no one will learn the lesson that we must stop this guilt, we must stop this kind of injustice to humanity. There was something nice in your book about these poetry games. You was some sort of self-defensing by creating poetry games, and I like you to introduce them to our viewers.
Well,
You know, how
that,
it helped you to escape sufferings in concentration camp.
The problem was that we were not allowed to speak. We were not allowed to. So, and it was when a man was caught, and we were men and women laying on the floor and in these mattresses on bunk beds. And when the men were caught talking, they would be beaten, hit very, very brutally. And so we too, I mean, I was hit because I talked, but because I have a big nose, I could lift my blindfold was a bit lifted, and I could see under there, and I could see if the guards, at times I could see if the guards were around. I could see their feet. And I sometimes I was in the top bunk bed, so I could see. And so in those times, I could recite a bit of a poem, and but it was very, very few times in which I could do it, and that's why I have this story called poetry. And yes, while I was, and then I felt awful because I was reciting these poems, and then the guard comes in and he realizes that one of the prisoners has a very loose blindfold, and he hits this person for not telling that his blindfold was. And so my reflection is I should have been talking about conditions to protect him rather than reciting poetry. And that's a choice nobody should be forced to make, right? And so that's a choice that happens when you're barely surviving. But in prison, I started to recite poetry. It was not allowed either, and our poetry books were confiscated, and they were, people, like you said, they were looking for Marxist stuff to punish us and send us to isolation. But I started to recite in public. I was 22 years old. I started to recite in poetry in public to my friends in prison. And when time to give, we had an hour we could go outside the cell. We were 4 people in the cell with a latrine in the cell, and we ate in the cell. We went to the bathroom, but we were let out to take a shower and to be a little bit in the hallway. And in those times, we organized literary events in the showers. And so if the guard was coming, we would jump in the showers and pretend we were taking a shower. But we painted with, we would melt, I mean, we would boil clothing to get colors, and we would paint. And those letters, some of these things we could send to our children. I wrote many poems about little frogs and little dogs and ants, and those are now in a book, and those could get to my daughter and other children. But we were always trying to keep our humanity. We did theater, and I recited, I always say that was a truly captive audience. You know, in English it translates because it's captive audience is an audience that really wants to hear you. But this audience they didn't have any other program to go to, right? So these are my friends. Right. They're still write to me and read my work and recite, and it's just it gives me a lot of strength to see that.
If Rati Saxena to make section 2 or part 2 from her book, The Fist Which Opens, I think more experiences will be added to her book, even with the cases from the book itself. Alicia is an icon in poetry, and her experience actually offers a full kind of drama for expressing that journey, that long journey to fight for justice. I was asking when you was talking about poetry and how are we healing by poetry? Is poetry coming alone like words they are not enough, or should be accompanied by music, painting, performance? I mean, words can be only healing, or they need some sort of performance attached with that word.
I don't think there is a one way, right? There is no one way. And I write also about how in situations of a lot of oppression and repression, the poetry becomes very difficult to understand because you are hiding your all feelings, humanity. You are working with ways that the torturers, the perpetrators, the prison guards cannot understand. So I had to, when I wrote, and these poems could be sent to outside, I found some of my poems outside in exile with no name. Years after were published in some books as anonymous. But it was strong there. So the poetry, sometimes we say, oh, it's bad poetry. I say that testimonial poetry, the poetry that many survivors write, is the Cinderella of poetry, because the poets think, oh, it's bad poetry. It talks about real things. It's bad poetry, and the historians or say, oh, it's not history, it's not true, it's poetry. So that poetry is the one that I studied, the poetry written by the relatives that is popular. Is I have the privilege of having studied, and I developed these skills, but there is no one recipe. And in the States now, with the Black Lives Matter movement and with all the movement against racism, because it's in the United States, this is a moment, it's a very important moment in history where people are resisting, young people. My daughters, I had two more daughters, and they are marching in the streets, right, against injustice. And young people are reciting their poetry in the streets against the injustice. They are writing to honor those who are being killed by police brutality as we speak now. Another, the racism perpetrated. I mean, it's the way this is naturalized. I mean, they kill one more young Black guy or color guy or Latino guy in the streets, and it's we see it in the movies, we see it on TV, but when they report internationally about what is happening in the United States, they only report about the violence that people do when they riot. And if you see, most of the marches they're peaceful. There's no riots, and they just show that the people who are resisting the racism and fighting against it are the brutal ones, So I use my poetry. The first time I saw somebody combine the telling of atrocities and poetry was when I saw Dennis Brutus. Dennis Brutus was a South African poet who was in prison with Mandela. And he lived in exile in the United States. And I saw him at an Amnesty International conference, and I was, wow, he was reciting the poetry and he was telling what was going on in South Africa with the apartheid. And so it was a moment of illumination. I said, oh, this can be done. So Dennis Brutus was my first inspiration to go, perform.
Yeah, and I want Rati also to tell us about this ways of expressing poetry.
Actually, what I wanted to say that Sometimes when we are in a deep sorrow, we write poetry. But sometimes, if you are in a deep sorrow, you become numb. It happened to me. Is it clear? Huh? It happened to me that when I was watching these people going back to home in this recently 4 months back, I talk about the migrants in India, and I couldn't write a single word in the poetry. I could not. I was just writing article with the prose, with the anger, because I was so upset, so angry. I do not know to whom. Maybe to myself, because I'm not able to go out and help them like young people can do. And so I couldn't write anything for 4 months. So it is sometime it happened that pain comes in a form of poetry. And but this is true that poetry helps in a, because here also when there were some agitation, some students were marching for some against some rules and some what they didn't like, they were using poetry, they were
Yeah.
singing. So
Slogans,
singing is
all
best.
slogans. Oh, yeah.
But slogans were in poetic form. They were
Yeah.
singing together. So that helped them also. It's a good also. So now, please, Ashraf, you were saying something. Mm.
Yeah, no, I was confirming that in revolutions there are some sort of special poets who are generating lines to be sung or to be said in a long term, and the ears of those activists are ready to repeat those lines because they maybe the musicality, the deep, and also they are encouraging them to go ahead. It means they activate them more. So it is the generating activity in everyone who is against brutal activists, like brutal acts of police in media. Actually, I was commenting on that when Alicia told us about what is brought about the US is not those who are peaceful against the system, but the violence. Actually, this is the game of the media. Media is not helping the peaceful resistance. They are in very need to the violence because they are selling the violence. Everything is for the sake of violence. The violence will sell weapons. The violence will buy drugs. The violence is giving the market more and more tools to capitalize the money everywhere. But the peaceful act, which is one sort of movement in poetry, in art, in every kind of, in every type of life, they don't want that. They don't support that. They only support the violence in media. And that's why I am calling to repeat this experience of having poetry through virtual lines, because now we are accessing more viewers than closed festivals. In festivals, maybe 1,000 will see you, but internet, it is kept there and seen more and more. And in one day, it is here, it is 5 o'clock in the evening, it is 12 o'clock in Argentina, and maybe 8 o'clock in Los Angeles, and it is 9 o'clock in India, but we are here together. So it is a matter of poetic travel to access through time and talk to people live.
Thank you. Yeah. Um, in these days, my poem, my translator into Hebrew, Iran, translated my poetry there, and now it's printed in leaflets in the demonstrations against Netanyahu. So in this marches against Netanyahu, my poem Communication is given to the demonstrators there, because my book is coming out in Hebrew now. As we talk, they're printing it in Israel for distribution. And the way I met this translator is because that poem was on the metro in New York, and he was studying in New York. And so he liked it and he looked for me. And now we connect internationally in amazing ways. Thank you for organizing that festival, Rati. That it was a tour of force. All these poets, that festival was amazing. Thank you for the Kritya. Thank you.
Kritya is yours only. Please read some poems from your book, which you like to read, please. In English and in Spanish, you are good in both, because when you read in Spanish, you shine.
Acting.
Okay, I'm going to read from Flowering Fires, and it's I wasn't ready for this. I'm going to read Ars Political. It's a poem that came out for Kritya too. Is that okay? Yes, right? and this poem is today dedicated to Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ramona Medina, Andres Guardado, y Vanessa Guillen. Ars Political. A verse stripped of all manipulation and adornment, so no one can say that after Auschwitz, after the conquest, after so many diminutive Esmas, so many tiny Sabras and Shatilas, and all the bombed out Fallujahs, after Breonna, George, Ramona, Andres, Vanessa, so that no one can say that nothing remains for us to say, that nothing still dryly cuts apart the brain, the tongue, and whatever other viscera are given the luxury of throbbing with grief. This was translated by Gail Ronsky, my translator. Arte Política, hoy dedicado a Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ramona Medina, Andrés Guardado, Facundo Castro y Vanessa Guillén. Un verso desnudo de todo malabar y adorno para que nadie diga que después de Auschwitz, que después de la conquista, que después de tantas diminutas esmas, de tantas pequeñitas sabras y yatilas de Ruanda, de Kosovo, de todas las Fallujah bombardeadas, de Breonna, George, Facundo, Ramona, Andrés, Vanessa, para que nadie diga que nada que decir nos queda, que nada ya nos parte en seco el cerebro, la lengua y alguna que otra víscera que se da el lujo de palpitar los duelos. Thank you, Rati, for asking me.
Yeah.
Do you want to ask some more questions? Do you want to read her more poems in translation?
Are people going to get tired? I want to read a poem by Evangelina Arce. Evangelina Arce is a mother of Ciudad Juarez. Her daughter is a victim of the feminist side in Mexico. And when I met her and I got her poems, she's a woman who went to second grade only and started to write poetry after they disappeared her daughter, Sylvia. And she is disappeared and killed. And I'm going to read a poem that she wrote and my students translated for my daughter, Sylvia. Daughter, I know you're not with me. 1,000 times I know you are lost in another world. I thought this year I'd have you with me, that your children and I would celebrate with you. My dreams are to love and care for you so much in the loving arms of your children and mine. And your family is your sisters and brothers, your children who will never forget you, and your mother who is always with you. I yearn to see your light and that this path takes me to where you are. You were a little star shedding light on your path, a little shooting star. You were a pretty and happy rose, so cheerful, and your perfume spilled in that place that no longer exists. There, your perfume penetrated. Is there time for it in Spanish, or?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
This
there
is
is
the
a
original.
time
This
belongs
is
to
the
us.
This is the original poem by Evangelina Arce, the mother of Ciudad Juárez. Hija, yo sé que tú no estás conmigo, 1000 veces lo sé que tú te encuentras en otro mundo perdido. Yo este año pensé tenerte conmigo con la intención de que tus hijos y yo festejáramos contigo. Son ilusiones amarte y quererte con mucho amor entre los brazos de tus hijos y yo. Y tu familia, tus hermanos y tus hermanas, tus hijos que nunca te olvidarán y tu madre que siempre contigo está. Quisiera ver tu luz y el camino me llevara hasta donde estás. Fuiste una estrellita que iluminabas tu camino y esa estrellita fugaz. Fuiste una rosa bonita y alegre y tan risueña y tu perfume se derramó en ese lugar que ya no existe. Allí tu perfume se penetró. Evangelina Arce, mother of Ciudad Juárez.
Thank you, and thank you for calling here. Now we have 4 poets in this talk show for this evening. And,
I wish she had access. I wish she had access to a computer, and she lives in a very marginalized way. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I know
Ashraf, do you have more Arabic translation of Alicia's poem? Because it looks very good when you talk, when you read.
I love to hear that.
You know, I will read. It is English, but I can translate it like automatic. You know. Now it is English. Girl, your mother isn't in prison. Your mother has birds in her blood. So I will talk. I will say it as if live translation. It is يا ابنتي أمك ليست في السجن. أمك لديها دماء في دمها طيور وهي ستخترق تلك القضبان فلا تحبسها ولا يحبسها أحد ولن تعود في السجن بعد ذلك ولن تتركك أبدا. This is English. I read it from the screen in Arabic.
It's to write you, my son Caramel. Is that it, right? To write you, my son Caramel, my chiquita, I could have to gather so much tenderness. And your mother, my love, your mother has hardened. Her soul is made of stone. She almost never cries, except when she writes to you, my son Caramel, my moon crystal. See,
but we need it in Spanish. We need it in Spanish.
In Spanish. I wrote it in prison in Spanish. Para escribirte a vos, caramelo de sol, chiquita mía, tendría que juntar tanta ternura y tu madre, mi amor, tu madre es dura, casi no llora nunca, tiene de piedra el alma, casi no llora nunca salvo para escribirte, caramelo de sol, cristalito de luna. My daughter is now a poet. Ruth Irupe Sanabria, and she writes about these things, about, the trauma and about, she writes about political repression, and she's a better poet than I am, of course.
Oh, wow.
No, she started earlier.
Can you sing some poems? Because she sings very well, Ashraf. She sings also. Poetry. So will you sing? Because I remember that in Mysore you sang some poems. Lullaby, some lullaby poem. I remember.
Yeah.
No, because of the screen, I only have little access to the text. So it is a screen in front of me. But I promise you that there will be more video recording and poetry, Arabic.
Thank you.
For all of us.
Yeah, and I promise you now, because I promised in private, but I promise I'm going to translate your work into Spanish. I translated some of Rati's poems into Spanish.
Thank you.
So once they are in English, I don't know where this poem that you are asking me for is. Tu madre. Okay, yeah. I think it's here. No. Okay, I'm afraid. I'm gonna sing it. Tu madre no está presa, tu madre tiene pájaros en la sangre, no la detienen. Las rejas, los barrotes, ni los candados. Tu madre no está presa, ni te ha dejado. Tu madre no está presa, niña, tu madre. Echa a volar los pájaros de su sangre, si llegan hasta tu alma y allí hacen nido, que vos puedas gritarles, ya amanecido, que vos puedas gritarles, ya amanecido. Thank you. I think we've been here an hour already, right? So getting too excited. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rati, to be with you.
So thanks a lot, Alicia. I always wanted you to be here because I wanted to introduce my my friends here in India, and this is actually this, as Ashraf says, that because of these technology, I can introduce. But I was writing when I came to your university. It was a fantastic because we enjoyed a lot, and many good talks and many good discussions were happening there. I wanted people to know that there are people who are actually so genuine as a poet in a poetry, not only for their being, their well-being or their emotional journey. It is the journey which goes with the country, is the journey which goes with the people, and journey which is continuous, as you are searching is still the lost babies and lost mothers and all. You are connecting people. So that is how one poet, that is a one wonderful journey of a poet, fruitful journey. I always thank to Ashraf Aboul because he is a fantastic reader, and he asks very sharp and very, he remember every nice thing, and he knows where is what. So I assure you that his poetry is fantastic, because some of them I translated into Hindi for someone. Yeah, especially the war poetry. It was fantastic because there are only few poets I find, one from Serbia and one is Ashraf, that they can bring love also in war. That is, the war poetry is not a cruel. His war poetry is with love. that is actually very fine emotions in a poetry, which I could not create. When I'm angry, my poetry is angry. When I am happy, my poetry is happy. I write articles. I write. So I thank you both, and I thank you whoever could enjoy it, listen it. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Thank you. Thanks to the audience too. Thank you.
Namaskar.
So I leave now. Right.